Okay, welcome back. So let's go ahead and create a test JSP. I'm going to call it a login.jsp. And I'm going to create it in my views folder. And then I need to create a test servlet, and I'm just going to call it, or test controller. I'm going to call it index controller finish. So we need to add a few things. We need to give it an annotation called controller. And if you remember, back in our dispatcher servlet, I'll deal with the red thing in a minute. We gave it this MVC annotation driven, and that's what this is doing. It's allowing us to use these annotations to tell our base controller what to do. We then give it some methods to use. So I'm going to do a public, and we have to do a return string, and I'll explain why in a second. So return so this string that we're returning, and that's all this method is going to do, we're doing that because if I go back here to this picture, the controller is sending back to our dispatcher the thing, it's sending back to our dispatcher a string to put in between our prefix and suffix. And that's how you go to a new web page, is you return a string to go in between this prefix and suffix. That's what the controller does. And as everything, or as always, we are going to have to, just like with the servlets, we have to do a request mapping annotation. And how that works is something like this. So we import the annotation. And then, okay, so it's going to look something like this. We give it a request mapping. The value is the same as with the servlets, what we would normally give it the mapping. And then the method tells us whether we're going to keep the information hidden or not. The same as it was with servlets, except in servlets we had to have a get and a post method for each servlet. In the controller, you're telling each one of the methods whether to hide the information or not. So this tells us the URL path and whether to hide the information or not. That's all that's doing. So in order to make sure that this is working, I'm going to go into my JSP and I'm going to do a tag, and just have it display the word test. I'm not really sure why I'm getting an error here. So give me a second to figure that out. Okay, so welcome back. Basically my error, I needed to have that without a space. What to do? Those little tiny things can come back and bite you in the butt. But so let's go ahead and run this. And because we need to run it from this servlet, we have to run it from the very top. Otherwise, it's not going to be able to find anything. So we're just going to make sure it's added to our server and then just run. And fingers crossed we don't get any errors so we can start using this stuff. If we have errors, then well, we have errors. So it's trying to do something, but if I look at my error, class not found, it's not finding my web servlet dispatcher, which could just be I misspelled it, so I'm going to go ahead and check that real quick. So that's probably where my error is. Give me just a minute. Okay, welcome back. So what I had was this, but because I'm using the dispatcher servlet, I need to make sure it says dispatcher servlet. Simple as that. So let's go ahead and run and see if we have any other errors that I need to possibly work out and fix. All right. So I'm seeing some errors, or like obviously we have an error. So there's lots of different things into this. But just a quick troubleshooting tip. This is the exception that it's given, or that is throwing at us, and this is what caused it. Now you'll see it's saying file not found, and then it's giving a path. We need to make sure that our dispatcher servlet is in WebINF, which if I look, it doesn't seem to be. So let's go ahead and just try to move it into WebINF and see if that fixes it. Otherwise, we would need to give it something else here to give it the file pathing, which is a perfectly legitimate thing to do, but just the simplest thing is to try and put it with the other XML that we have. We want it with the web XML. So let's try and rerun this. And see what we have. Okay, looks like it found it, and it took us to the correct JSP page. So what we have is we have created a dispatcher servlet. We're finding the dispatcher servlet. And then we're going to the correct controller and then loading up the correct JSP. Now, let's go ahead and create the form. Let's go ahead and create a login JSP. So I'm gone ahead and done that. This should be fairly similar to the forms that we've created with the servlets. The JSP isn't really going to change any, but maybe some things that you haven't seen that I'll point out here. What that is doing, the highlighted thing, is it's getting the base URL that we're already on, and then just adding on a little bit to it. There are many ways of doing this. Throughout most of my HTML stuff, I've done something like that. And that does something very similar to that. So this 2 dots thing does something very similar to this page context.request.contextPath, except it gets the entire URL that it's at right now and then goes back one. So what I would end up doing in the case of this line 11 that I wrote is it would actually go ahead and just do this, authenticate, which may or may not be what you want. Really not sure. The whole point, though, of Spring is keeping our context paths, our URLs, to be a uniform manner, so all we ever have to do is change the end. Because what... Okay, little side note, how a URL generally works. Is you have the context path. So we have the context path. And let me make it a little bit bigger. So we have the context path. And then we have the action. So we what's happening ooh, that's not good. Or what we're trying to accomplish with Spring is that the context path should always be the same, and then your actions correspond to servlets, and the methods within your servlets, that's what we're trying to accomplish here. So, with that being said, our action will just be tagged onto the end of our context path, onto the base URL we want everything to follow. The decision has been made to use the page context rather than doing some other way. So let's go ahead and once again, well, before we run this, we're going to have to do an authenticate method. I'm gonna make this within my index controller because this is the first page that I'm doing. I want everything for my first page to be on its own controller. So I'm going to go ahead and do an authenticate method. And then the URL pathing will be authenticate. But this time, because I want the information hidden, I'm going to go ahead and give it post. I can't return just login though. What I have to return is two things. I have to test if user name. I'm going to have to test if my username and password match a user. And then I'm going to have to return either login, so it goes back to the same login page if it didn't work, or I return the home page. And if I look at my what is it called? My assignment, they call it the welcome page. So I'm going to go ahead and, rather than returning home page, I'm going to return welcome. But how do I get the information from my JSP to my controller? In servlets, we did like a request.get parameter, blah, 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 blah. We don't have a request. So how do we get our information? And to do that, we have to use something called models. And that's what the M in MVC stands for. It's model view controller. We've already talked about views, which is the JSP pages, and controller, which is what we're working on, and then a model. Well, what's a model? A model we've used before, right? So what we have to do with our model is make sure we match on our JSP page all of this information. So the only two things we're passing in are username and password. So we need to make sure that on our JSP page, the name on the input matches. So we have an input for username, and I'm just going to go ahead and copy it and paste it over. And I built it so it matches, but in case you didn't and you're having issues, which hopefully I'll show at the end of this video, that's how you would do it. Now, we have it matching on the JSP page. We need a way to tell it that it's supposed to match. So we have to give another annotation. We have to give it an annotation called model attribute. Possible. Okay. We want the model to be a user, and we're just going to call it user. Import the correct user, and then we have to import the model attribute. This is going to allow us to use the information that we've passed in via this model. So we say if user.get username, and so because I don't want to create any data in my user master at this point in time, they don't even tell us to do that in this assignment. All I'm going to go ahead and do is just hard code in a username, and I'm going to call it Snoopy, because my cat. And I want to say user.get password, and then I want it to be equal whatever password I pass it. So long as the username equals Snoopy and the username equals rules, then go to the welcome page. Otherwise, go to the login page. So now we have hopefully a login validation working.